Hey everyone, Matt here over at LimaCharlie. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to kind of kicking off this series that we're going to be doing here at part of LimaCharlie, showing how you can utilize the LimaCharlie SecOps cloud platform in order to find some more effective and efficient security operational capabilities. This is part one of a four-part series. Hopefully, everyone who's joining me today is aware that there are multiple parts to this series, and that we'll be running a few of these dealing with very, very specific niche CISO issues or things that we've seen kind of in the industry and whatnot. This very first session today, which I'm excited to get kicked off with everyone, is going to focus specifically on solving tool sprawl, or dealing with and talking about tool sprawl and the different things that are out there. So with that said, I'm Matt. I'm the lead solutions engineer over here at LimaCharlie. As mentioned in the Zoom chat, if anyone has any questions or anything that I can help answer, please feel free to ask those or send them into the chat. And if there's any questions or anything that I can drill into, happy to do those as well. Let's go ahead and jump into it. The first thing I want to do is really address the sprawl and kind of this issue that we've been seeing, that the industry's been seeing, that I think a lot of folks are dealing with right now. And I like to always level set if possible and just kind of, tackle and kind of deal with what this issue might actually look like and whatnot. So I'm going to go ahead and throw out maybe a couple of questions, if you will, or really a couple of questions, a couple of observations. We have a ton of conversations with a ton of folks from a ton of organizations, and this common, constant, growing problem that we see is this idea of sprawl. Now, it's really hard to narrow down exactly what type of sprawl we're talking about, because there really is just kind of so much happening. And I never used to be a big fan of the word sprawl until I started to understand more of just how wide and vast these footprints are getting. The first one we'll pick up on is tool sprawl. I've actually got some stats and a couple of slides to back this up. However, tool sprawl is becoming one of the biggest issues that I think a lot of cybersecurity analysts are having to deal with these days, primarily because it does force them to focus on, well, I've got so many tools in my environment, there's so much coverage, or there's a lack of coverage, or there's too much overlap, or there's a visibility gap, I'm not sure what's what, but it creates this really, really large vacuum of knowledge that is very difficult to fill in. It's also very hard for folks to kind of really wrap their heads around the number of tools that are inside of an organization. And I'm going to be walking through some of the stats in a moment, as I mentioned, to kind of demonstrate what this looks like, but it's pretty intense. It's a lot of tools that are out there. So tool sprawl, but I see this as one that is impacting security analysts, SOCs, security managers, incident responders, and those who are charged with protecting an organization and bringing everything, into one place and saying, yeah, we've got coverage across this. The next one's going to be vendor sprawl. Very similar to tool sprawl. Sometimes they can be shared. Sometimes they can be independent. I can have 50 different tools from 50 different vendors. I can also have 50 different tools from 10 different vendors. It just depends. But the vendor sprawl also steps outside of security a little bit as well. I know we're talking about a security operations kind of focus on here, but a vendor sprawl takes us outside of the idea of, okay, this is just a security issue. It takes us outside of that. This is just a tooling issue. And it takes us into that concept of how many vendors are we actually dealing with, maybe from not just a security perspective, but from an organizational perspective. And this can range from everything from third-party vendors, cloud providers, SaaS applications, just how much coverage you have out there. We won't dig into it too much today, but vendor sprawl can also introduce a really significant weak link in your attack surface. Or in your supply chain risk profile, because the number of vendors I have deployed out there also means the number of connections that might be into my environment. We'll talk a little bit about consolidating some of these as an approach here, but it can open up a vast world of supply chain issues and attack surface issues. But it's important to know that the more we bring on, the larger that sprawl gets. A cloud sprawl is the third kind of category I've picked up on here. This one's very straightforward. A cloud sprawl means you're simply stretched across too many cloud platforms. I know it's hard from an organizational and from a development perspective. It's very, very difficult to say, okay, we're going to go all in on this one cloud platform and we're going to stick with this thing and we're going to build out everything here. You have developers who may find preference of one over the other. prices change, contracts change, requirements change. Maybe my business starts to move into a federal space or out of a federal space. Maybe we move to other countries, geographic things pop up. Maybe a sweet deal came along and someone somewhere up the company with purchasing power, but without knowledge of what we were doing, inked us into a commitment that we now have to deliver on. We've seen all of the above happen before. And then one of my favorite ones that I think a lot of folks miss is organic growth. There's definitely plenty of times where I might have organic growth that brings another platform into my environment that I might not have necessarily had or accessed or dealt with before. And we've now got to make a change to kind of shift those things over and migrate those resources. But again, my security operations team is still charged with kind of protecting these solutions. I threw code sprawl in here as another one. We won't get into development practices and stuff today, but I do want to note it often becomes a security concern as well. This issue where we've got these massive code repositories, we're having now to deal with things like source code management, source code security, static analysis, dynamic analysis. And again, it comes down to, is this a developer issue? Is this a engineering issue? Is this a security issue? Which one does this fall into? Regardless, I find that it all rolls up to security in some way, shape, or form, because even if the security team isn't monitoring this, they are expected to provide insight, feedback, and usually they are charged with the mission of protecting that organization. So I tend to say that the security folks will end up having to share a little bit of responsibility for this one. And then last but not least, this one I really have to zoom in on. Every single example I've talked about before increases your attack surface. Every single one that I don't have eyes around, I don't have visibility into, I don't have insight on, just expands my attack surface as an organization and makes it very, very tough for folks to really wrap their hands around just how big of a footprint we might have as an organization. The larger the enterprise gets, the more complexity you can expect in every single one of these sprawling issues. We didn't even talk about things like ingress and egress points. We didn't talk about tech debt. We didn't talk about all those. There are multiple ways that sprawls can reach out. But the most important one, I think, is to understand that it's a risk. It's a risk to have your attack surface this vulnerable or this far spread out, because as a security team, it's hard to contain it. It's hard to say with confidence, yes, we're able to wrap everything around that. So not to fearmonger or anything like that, but it's an important thing to note that managing complex environment can be itself a complexity. I went and pulled some statistics and we'll walk through a few of these now. April 2024 survey, firms on average are dealing with between 60 and 75 security tools. Folks, 60 to 75 security tools in an environment. And I just kind of want to sit back as someone who spent a lot of time sitting in incident response and dealing with really pretty much any data set that my clients had at the time. 60 to 75 different data sources. That's how I'm going to classify these things now. I'm going to break them down to 60 or 75 telemetry sources. Is way too much for a small team of analysts to have to deal with. It's way too much for someone to have to go through and check all these different dashboards. It's way too much to say, well, which one of these is the adversary going to come through? I need to prioritize every single one, or which one do I look at? We'll talk in a minute or two about the way that SOC processes have developed because of this. But it's really important to understand that when we talk about tool sprawl, I'm not talking about you have two seams running and there's a little bit of data duplication in there. I'm not talking about the data lake that you still have going on that probably should be decommissioned, but everyone still got it out there. I'm talking about 60 to 75 tools that are featured or are a part of your tech stack and your security posture. When we say tool sprawl, this is not that thing that's still turned on. These are those tools that your analysts likely just don't have time to dig into, but probably still contain valuable information inside of them. Another statistic I pulled from a CISO online survey, very similar time frame as well, earlier 2024. I found some really key points inside of this too. When it comes to detecting and prioritizing vulnerabilities, folks found that 90% of respondents used 3 or more tools. One of the biggest obstacles was prioritization, and multiple challenges made it too difficult because there was just too many tools. We weren't aware of where to pull the tools from or where the best data was at or the difficulty of correlating alerts amongst them. again, we fall back into the same old patterns of overloading our SOCs and overloading our analysts with just too many things that are going on, too much sprawl, too much reach. And we want to find ways to bring that down. So I threw 2 pop quizzes in here. You don't have to answer these ones out loud, but for those of you who are maybe in those security management or security leadership roles, I want you to first answer or think to yourself, or at least start to explore this idea within your own team. What is your analyst to tool ratio? So if you're one of those orgs that does have 60, 70 tools, how many analysts do you have to deal with those particular tools? And what is the ratio of their ability to look through those? I'm going to take a shot in the dark and say the larger security team you have, the more focus there is towards 1 or 2 behemoth tools that kind of constitute primary response actions, and everything else is a secondary measure, but we'll talk about that in just a minute or two. Analyst to tool ratio, I think, is a very good metric to start to establish because it allows you to see, is my staff stretched too thin? If I have a SOC of 10 and I have 70 tools in place, that's an analyst to tool ratio of 7. That doesn't mean everyone's looking at 7 tools. That means I've got to consider, is that 7 dashboards that everyone's looking at? Is that 7 logins? Is that 7 sets of permission? Is that 7 MFAs? Is that 7 things that they might need to get into? And then I want to introduce the idea of prioritization and time. If I've got 7 tools per analyst, and we're using hypothetical math here, but if I've got 7 tools per analyst, how long would it take them to cross-correlate one alert in one platform to another alert or another source of telemetry in another? Because the window in between those, that window right there is where adversaries find success. But let's say high level. I got another ratio out here for you as well. What is your analyst to telemetry ratio? 2 things to think about: analyst to tool ratio and analyst to telemetry ratio. Meaning maybe 1 analyst for 7 tools is a ratio I'm happy with, but how much telemetry is being generated? This is where we get into alert fatigue, analysis paralysis, and analysts who unfortunately just can't keep up with the amount of volume and amount of traffic that's being sent into the SOC or that they're being responsible for analyzing. I wanted to drop one little quick note. I pulled another statistic out of this, and I know I mentioned different types of sprawls that are out there. It's not just number of tools. Sprawls can also extend from other places. I grabbed this stat from the SiliconANGLE article. I found this one to be kind of interesting, but some of the biggest drivers here were multi-cloud, hybrid security, so multi-cloud environments, which I talked about earlier, but compliance requirements and insurance mandates are 2 other big ones that I think are top driver when it comes to tool displacement or tool implementation inside of an environment, because they might not be something that the security team actually wants or has vetted or has spent time with, but unfortunately they are inserted because some type of thing is needed or some type of requirement needs to be met. With that said, I think it's a really good, that's a good foundation for our problem statement for this particular webcast, which is there's just too much stuff. There's too many things for analysts to look at. Now, I'm going to pause here. Not pause, but I'm going to stop and kind of continue with this little monologue here of, I don't want to create a single 1 tool platform that you need to log into and all of your problems will be solved. I would love it if it existed, but I want to introduce the idea of LimaCharlie's SecOps cloud platform, a cybersecurity cloud provider for not just cybersecurity capabilities, but for solving whatever type of sprawl you might have. I've got some examples that I'm going to work through, that I'm going to talk about how this works and how they can come together. But I want to go back here, and I just want to sit on this one for a moment and say the SecOps cloud platform approach does not answer the question of, I only need 1 tool to do everything, right? Can I bring all my analysts down to 1 tool? Can we just completely revamp what we've got? A lot of times, folks, especially at that leadership level, the answer is no, you can't. Just being upfront, a lot of times your SOC processes, your incident response playbooks, your regulatory requirement, your compliance requirements are built around a set number of minimum tools, meaning there might be 2 or 3 staple tools in the environment that have to stay in there. But again, if you've got a sprawl of 50 to 60 to 70, but you're only having 2 or 3 tools that actually drive processes and drive playbooks, we need to find a way to account for those other 60 or 70. And that's one of the things that I wanted to bring in today, is talk about how we can help maybe lower that number and solve that particular tool sprawl. So I came up with a couple of example approaches that we're going to walk through and we're going to discuss here to kind of drive these home. The first one I came up with is a very typical approach that we see in a lot of security operations centers, which is there is usually some sort of detection and response driving platform that is a primary source of telemetry. A lot of times it's EDR. I'm not going to say it is 2020 and everyone is focused solely on EDR, but I will say that there are a large number of organizations out there where EDR or an XDR platform, if you have it, is some sort of driver for primary detection mechanisms. If you think about things like open source rule sets or private closed rule set, Yara rules, Sigma rules, things that are often used in detection engineering, when we see blog posts written, they're often host and network indicators provided. Detections are often written from a host-based perspective. Bypasses and evasions and the latest, greatest thing that adversaries doing are often host-focused. Well, for the most part, but we'll talk about that in a second. However, EDR ends up following and becoming this primary driver for a lot of things, and everything else becomes a secondary or tertiary data source. So the typical approach has been dump it all into a SIEM, and if we need it at some point, we'll go and we'll search for it and we're all set. Let me know if your environment, don't let me know, but think about in your head if this looks a lot like how you've done it. The problem is the things that are off to the right are often treated as, well, if we need to go access them, we will. But there's an issue with this approach. The issue here is that these aren't just random sources of telemetry. These are actually very valuable high fidelity sources of telemetry because the threat landscape that's out there has changed. I have adversaries who now can live entirely in just these particular sources. Over the course of my career, I spent a lot of time doing email compromise searches. In a lot of email compromise cases that I would work and intrusions and data breaches, never touched an endpoint agent. They never touched that primary source of telemetry. It was always a secondary source of telemetry like email access logs or email inbox changes. And that was a secondary source, but it was the primary source for detecting an adversary. Do I want to get rid of EDR to find those? No, because I still need my EDR. And am I invalidating what my team is doing? No, I just need to find a way to prioritize the right set of data. So identity management tools, source code management tools, network data, which again, using EDR as primary, network might be secondary. Even cloud platform telemetry can be very high sources of fidelity. But if I'm not utilizing it, or if I'm just dumping it into a sink or a lake, hoping that maybe one day I'll need it or I need to find value in it, then it's just going to stay that way. It's going to stay as a secondary data source or a tertiary data source. We want to change that. So one of the first approaches is rather than dump all of that data into a database, treat it as a first-class source. Elevate it to the same level that I am with endpoint data. Elevate it to the same level that I am with XDR data. Don't dump it into a lake and just let it sit there. Bring it into a platform like LimaCharlie. We treat every single data source as first class, meaning detection can be written for, can be procured against any source that's out there. All of a sudden, I'm taking all of my telemetry sources and I'm escalating them within a single platform. And I'm not saying all. Remember, we're talking tool sprawl here, 50, 60, 70 tools. I don't want to replace every single one. I want to bring the number of dashboards that I need to look into from 10, 20, whatever it is, down to 2, 3, 4. I want that analyst to tool or analyst to dashboard ratio to come all the way down to as close to 1-to-1 as I possibly can, understanding that 1-to-1 is very difficult. So let me kind of revamp what this SOC approach looks like. One size does not fit all. I am aware that for different organizations, I'm going to have different data types. I want to find a way to consolidate those into a place that my analyst can get the most value out of them. And then I can treat them at the same level that I would treat any other high fidelity source that would come in. So my approach here is reduce the number of dashboards, reduce the reliance on additional tools out there, utilize platforms like LimaCharlie as consolidation detection platforms. So my analyst might only need to log into 2 or 3 or 4 things as opposed to 10, 12, 15 things. Let's bring that number down. So solving tool sprawl is not about ripping and replacing everything with one size fits all, because one size does not fit all. Instead, it's about finding and building the right dashboards that take place. Now, I don't have this little tidbit drawn in here, but I'll say you could even utilize LimaCharlie as a consolidation point and feed it into your SIEM if you wanted to help then bring it down to just one or two platforms. But being able to operationalize every data source is an important step to bringing down or reducing that kind of tool sprawl. Approach number two, and this will probably be the last one that we'll finish up with today, is meant to be a kind of focus on just how intricately linked all of the different things that are out there are linked. I can have multiple cloud platforms. I can have multiple identification providers. I can have IAMs. I can have Active Directory. I can have identity providers. I can have all sorts of legacy tools. I can have a combination of platforms from a bunch of different acquisitions, mergers, tech stacks, preferences, whatever it might be. There's a bunch of things we can rope in here. I can rope in multi-factor authentication providers. I can rope in identity verification tools, identity security, identity detection and response tools. It doesn't matter. Just understand that within most enterprises these days, identity management and identity kind of control and capabilities is a paramount need. Unfortunately, when we talked about sprawl, how exactly do we go through and control, correlate, and understand just how wide that identity sprawl actually is? Because if I have developers, if I have security folks, if I have users who go out to any platform they want, simply log in through an SSO provider, log in through a secondary or tertiary identity provider, my sprawl gets bigger and bigger, wider and wider. Now, if everyone's just developing test projects, I don't really care. But if I've got developers utilizing whatever was the most convenient form of logging in at the time, coupled with production code, I'm now dealing with a bigger security risk than I might have had before because I don't have a unified approach to identification. I don't have a unified approach to authorization. And I need to rein that in order to cut the sprawl down. So I posit this as a solution. First off, one thing that we don't really get into talking about when we talk about LimaCharlie is I've got retention included with LimaCharlie, a full year of retention included. And as I mentioned earlier, every single thing that gets brought into LimaCharlie gets treated as first-class telemetry. So I'm going to recommend and say, look at LimaCharlie as an intermediary step in there. Look at it as a platform to help consolidate and bring all of this data into one place. However, it's not just treating it as a point of consolidation. Let's say I want to automate action in between these two. Here, I'm utilizing identification and authorization as a way to interact with, as a way for someone to log into cloud platforms. But what if I want to write detections on top of these? What if I want to write rules on top of these? What if I want to analyze this activity and look for suspicious outliers, anomalies, whatever it might be? Well, my cloud platforms are only going to go so far. My cloud platforms do have some capabilities built in. Think about things like CloudTrail logs or some of the other things that you might find built into cloud vendor logs. There are some security implementations in there, but they might not be turned on by default. Depending on the cloud provider, you're going to likely have to upgrade your license level to get there. We want to change that for you, LimaCharlie. First off, as I mentioned, the retention. I've gone through this slide a little bit already. Treating everything as a first-class telemetry allows me to then bring all of those different log sources into LimaCharlie and say, boom, now everything is first class. I can detect and respond against any of this data if I want to. But we're not just going to stop there. We've got a bidirectional capability inside of LimaCharlie that also lets me say, if a thing happens that I don't want to happen, if a thing occurs, if an account does a thing, if an account logs in, gets created, access to resources I don't want it to have, if anything occurs that my security team is not happy with, let me interact with and send a command back to the cloud platform to shut or lock that particular resource down. And that cloud platform can be that third-party SaaS app. It can be an identity provider. It can be an Active Directory. It can be whatever we need it to be. So there's also an automation play in here. But notice the coupling of automation with retention, with telemetry normalization. So my security team, who before might not have had visibility into all of these, now can gain visibility into it, number one. Number two, we've cut our sprawl down because I use a platform like LimaCharlie as my central place for detection and response. I use it as a central place for sending commands back and forth to my cloud platform. It now becomes my central identity, I don't want to say broker, but point of consolidation. It becomes the place where my security team says, I don't need to go log into these 3, 4, 5 different identity platforms, bring logs in and do some sort of spreadsheet-based analysis and correlation. I can bring everything into LimaCharlie. My retention is there for historical threat hunting if we need it. By the way, we'll talk about threat hunting in one of our later sessions. I can utilize it for detection and response, and I can utilize it for post-incident triage or post-incident analysis because there's a full year of retention built into it. And if I want to action on that data, and I want to say if so-and-so user is not supposed to do a thing, then let's issue commands to automatically prevent them from doing it. So in a nutshell, that's kind of two approaches that I thought would be worthwhile to talk about here. I'm going to stop and pause right here at the SecOps Cloud platform. Folks, it's been the first episode of our 4-part CISO series, but it's also been a really interesting discussion in how we can help you solve some of these problems. Tool Sprawl was the first one we issued. We're going to be looking at 3 others as the next few weeks go on as we work ourselves up to Black Hat. But I want to leave you with a little final note before we kind of wrap up the time here. First off, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. I can also be available in our community Slack if you want to join us there at slack.limacharlie.io. But the other thing I'll note is that LimaCharlie is not necessarily, depending on your workflow, going to be a full rip and replace, meaning we might not be that key step in every single part of your SOC analyst workflow. But if you currently are dealing with a SOC who's looking at 7, 10, 12, 15 different dashboards in order to get their job done, let's bring that number down to 3 or 4. Let's start there, solve that problem, work on that fatigue, and help make things a little bit easier for the team. Similarly, if you are staring down an environment that has 50, 60, 70 tools in it, and you're just way too concerned about, are we missing things? Are we not seeing things? Centralize that telemetry in one place and then start to work on operationalizing it. You shouldn't need to log into every single telemetry platform that's out there. You shouldn't. You should be able to easily just simply say, point it to my central source. My analysts interact with the central source. They're able to view, normalize, process, correlate, do everything in one place. We just streamline SOC operations as well. In any event, as I mentioned, this is our first series. Everyone, I'm Matt from LimaCharlie. A huge thanks for joining me today. Really appreciate you giving the time. These are meant to be really quick sessions focusing on key issues. If you have any questions, you know where to find me on the socials, LinkedIn, or in the LimaCharlie Slack. A huge thanks to you for joining me today. And if you're watching the recording and have any questions, again, you know where to find me. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you next time on our next little CISO series. Our next one will be on June 26th, which is going to be about a week from today. And we will be looking at reducing storage spend. With that said, have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you.